Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Vinyl Den, your channel for record collecting by record collectors. I'm Nick.
I'm Ian.
Today we're talking about everyone's favorite musical punching bag, disco music. There's a bunch of links down below. You got links for the Vinyl Den Facebook group, for the merch page, for the Spotify and Apple Music playlist that I put together every week, and the Patreon page. So make sure you check all that out. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button down below, and make sure you hit that notification bell so you're notified every time I release new episodes. So disco music really kind of started in the late 60s, early 70s. I don't think it really got popular till like the mid 70s though. And I know everyone hates disco music, and they had like disco sucks nights at sporting events, and they would like smash records, do all sorts of crazy stuff.
Which is silly, because you got to buy the records to smash them.
That's very true.
So you're just giving money to the artist anyway.
That's very true. And I think overall, I guess I should kind of preface this whole conversation by saying I'm not a disco fan, but I know you're not. You absolutely hate disco music.
But I have reason. I mean, I wouldn't say it's not the greatest reason, but I'll explain.
But I think it's almost kind of a necessary evil that we had in music. So prior to the emergence of disco music in the middle part of the 70s, music was really dominated by hard and heavy rock music, whether it's Aerosmith, Black Sabbath, all these other bands that were coming up, Led Zeppelin in the early part of the 70s. That I think disco music, as much as I dislike a lot of it, it was this like transition point. I think a lot of the ways like grunge was in the early part of the 90s, where grunge was this transition from this like different kind of rock music in the 80s to what alternative rock would become in the later part or the middle part of the 90s. I think disco was that transition point from hard and heavy rock in the early part of the 70s to a lot of stuff we would get in the early part of the 80s with like new wave music.
I think new wave came more out of of popifying.
It was. So
punk.
New wave was this like pop version, but it also incorporated a lot of the electronic elements, a lot of synthesizers, very heavy synthesizers that disco music used. It was really kind of helped transition, because you're right, that was coming from other areas also, but I think it was that disco music was really kind of the transition point where music came and went and what it would do moving forward, I think.
So for me, I guess I kind of see that, but to me it was just more of an extension of what pop music was in the 50s and 60s. It is essentially at its core just pop music.
Yeah.
And throughout history, there's always been music.
It's a different kind of pop music.
It is, but throughout history of music, there's always been music that was written specifically for dancing. And let's face it, that's what disco is.
It is, and that's kind of where it started from.
It's pop music that's to dance to. My problem with it is that beyond that, even on a pop rock or pop music level, it is extremely vapid.
It is, and it's very. There's very little depth and substance.
Right. And there doesn't
to
have
disco
to be
music,
for
but
dance
you're right.
music. And if it's just dance music, I mean, all of the old composers wrote waltzes, and their waltzes were just designed to be something to dance to.
Yeah.
You could argue that that's extremely vapid by the standards of classical composers. My biggest problem with it is that it just, I guess because it dominated so much, I mean, it really defined the 70s in many ways.
It didn't, though, because it was really, I would say from like 75, 76 is when it got kind of big. And then by 78, punk music was really kind of taking root, and music was really changing in a different direction. It's like, I look at it a lot of the ways, I think there's a lot of similarities between disco music and grunge music, because grunge was something else that lasted a very short period of time, but seemed to dominate an entire, or it's looked at as dominating an entire decade, when maybe it really didn't.
I feel like, though, and I could be wrong, because we'd have to look it up, but I feel like disco artists were still charting very heavily into 79, 80, 81 even, and punk bands weren't, and a lot of the hard rock bands
bands never really were,
right, but even the hard rock bands, they were charting, but it was, now they were sharing the charts with these disco artists.
I think by the time the 70s ended, I think you had a lot of maybe not disco artists, but softer rock musicians like Commodores, even though the Commodores had some disco, but you had like the Carpenters or artists, some different artists that were kind of coming up and really kind of help transitioning music also in the later part of the 70s.
See, with me for the Commodores, I mean, I would almost put them in like R&B.
Yeah, but they had a lot of disco-ish
Right.
songs also.
Well, I think there's some crossover there too. So, I mean, you could argue that even some of the funk bands of the 70s had crossover there because let's face it, funk is very rhythmic, and there's even though it's far deeper as a musical style than disco ever even dreamed of being, but there was some overlap there.
If you had a Venn diagram, there was overlap in the middle of that.
More in the fact that it was deeper music that came from a deeper place, but it could still be danced to. So as far as that goes, I guess so. And if you look at the pop music, like you said, the Carpenters, that almost is more of just kind of an extension of what was going on in the late 60s, in my opinion. More of that singer-songwriter, almost folky element, even though it had some disco-y elements to it.
Well, that's why I said it's a transition point, I think, for music.
And it could just be my bias against disco, but comparing disco to grunge is kind of insulting. Just because, like I said, I find most disco music to be rather vapid and shallow and empty, whereas grunge music was not.
Yeah, but there's a lot of people that look at grunge music in a similar way.
I don't see how.
I mean, I'm not saying that they're right. But I'm just saying, like, and the comparison I was making is it's a musical transition point. Grunge was that transition point from hair metal to alternative rock. I think that disco is kind of a transition point, not so much for rock music, but in general, like pop music.
From that bubblegum era to what we got in the 80s.
In the 80s.
Which, by the way, the 80s, this is just my opinion, but the 80s had the best pop music of any decade. It
was really good.
I mean, because I'm a sucker for a hook, and the 80s pop music had the best hooks.
Yeah, even a lot of the poppier rock music in the 80s had good hooks.
Yeah, absolutely.
I completely understand what you're saying. Disco music was very formulaic. It was very repetitive. It did have shallow lyrics. It was kind of, it was almost like music paint by numbers. Is I think, especially like in the later part of the 70s, I think a lot of that disco music all kind of sounded like the exact same song with slightly different lyrics.
Right.
And it was way over commercialized also. And I think that was another thing that really kind of led to some of the backlash that it had, was that it seemed like all these big labels were just pushing out this music just to make a quick buck off the artist.
Record labels doing that?
No,
I just don't
never.
buy it.
No, never.
That just sounds like nothing like the honorable record labels that we know of.
Yeah. But there was a lot of disco music that was very catchy. And I understand the mass appeal that it had. You could dance to it. It was fun. It was upbeat. A lot of the rock music before disco got really popular was kind of, I think darker, especially compared to a lot of the rock music in the later part of the 60s. And I think it was, disco was kind of the balancing point musically.
Well, disco doesn't require you. There's no effort involved from the listener.
I mean, there's a lot of good music like that, though.
Yeah, but disco, like, it thrived on it. It thrived on just being
a good, fun time is what it was.
Well, I mean, that's a matter of opinion.
And that was the kind of the whole party aspect that I think was built into a lot of disco music because, like you said, it did come from the club scene in the late part of the 60s.
Yeah, I guess just looking at it from, again, hindsight, but aside from the Bee Gees, can anyone really, truly think of any big disco-y? I mean, we could maybe.
Yeah.
Because we listen to music, or, we're more, up on music, but most people, you say disco, they think Bee Gees, and that's it.
And the funny thing is, but this is kind of a side note real quick, the Bee Gees, if you go back to the early part of their career, in like the late 60s, sounded absolutely nothing like that. They sounded more like Abbey Road kind of Beatles than anything disco-wise.
A little bit more pop, but you're right.
Very, they're known for disco music, but their music especially earlier in their career, was very much anything but disco music. So yeah, as someone that's never been a big fan of disco music, I think I've got 2 disco albums. I've got the best of the Bee Gees, and I've got the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack,
Which is essentially the best of the Bee Gees.
pretty much. Outside of that, this is really the only disco music I have. So I mean, I've never been a big fan of it, but like I said, I understand how people could really be drawn to it. I also can see how people can hate it the way they do, because like it even to this day, disco music has this really kind of strong stigma that just instantly causes sometimes really interesting reaction from people.
It's just so forgettable. That's, I think, at its core. That's kind of what I was alluding to. If
mean,
you ask the average person to name a disco group, it's the Bee Gees. That's it.
Donna Summer, she was a big one also.
Yeah, I guess, but overall, there's a very small amount of artists that people are even gonna recognize.
Yeah.
They might recognize a song here or there, but it's just so forgettable as a musical style.
I will also say that it was music from almost 50 years ago, or from 50 years ago. So I mean, the time can has
but you say
I think if you go back in time and ask people in the late 80s, early 90s to name disco artists,
Yeah,
I think they probably name quite a few of them.
Some of those artists were still around though too. They were
Yeah.
still producing music. They may have changed a bit, but
Because I think you can go back to you can go out today and ask people to name 5 artists from the late 60s. There's probably a lot of people out there that have a hard time doing it.
yeah, maybe.
So I think
Maybe
time,
without the Beatles and Rolling Stones.
exactly. There's a couple of big ones that everyone's going to know, but outside of that, I think people have a hard time naming like Country Joe and the Fish, things like that. Well, that's all we got for you today, guys. Thanks for checking the show out. Make sure you drop us a comment down below. Let us know what you guys think about disco music. Honestly, what do you think about disco music? Because like I said, I see both sides of this argument. I can see kind of the necessary evil that it was, but I do enjoy some of the music, though. But let us know what you guys think. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you see a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. And that's all we got. Until next time.
Talk to y'all later.
Keep on spinning. Peace.